Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our session today. Modernize your CIAM solution, enable remote customer onboarding, and streamline eKYC compliance with Azure AD B2C and Jumio. A few things to go over first. Please type your questions in the Q&A box, and we will address them during or at the end of today's presentation. We will be posting a link to our survey. Our surveys provide us with the ability to improve our processes, so we greatly appreciate your feedback. Your speakers today are Irene Ng, Senior Program Manager with Microsoft Identity Engineering, and Dean Nichols, Vice President of Marketing at Jumio Corporation. We'll be kicking off today's session with Irene. Over to you, Irene.
Thank you, Melissa. Hi, everyone. It's Irene. Thank you so much for joining us today. So today we'll be talking about the CIAM solution. And when you look into that, the reason why we're doing this, because this year alone, we have seen a rapid move on digital transformation, as our CEO, Satya, has mentioned, and worth of digital transformation in just 2 months. And we think that this digital transformation is not just in the enterprise space, but also in the consumer space. And for that, Dean, could you share more what you see on your end?
Sure. Thanks, Irene. If you really just Google Bing digital transformation, you will see all kinds of stats about how quickly it's moving. So the stat below is from the Financial Brand, and this is really talking about financial institutions, but they're seeing that institutions that are offering website and mobile checking now has reached about 82% of the market. And just a couple of years ago, it was at 66%. And by the way, this study was actually taken before COVID-19. So the rapid adoption of digital services, because people can't march into a branch office, is been pretty breathtaking. But at the same time, what's also been probably equally breathtaking is the amount of fraud that we've also seen. So according to LexisNexis, they said that digital identity verification, or the ability to ensure that someone is who they say they are when they try to access digital services, is the single biggest area of risk in cybercrime, right? So that is probably not surprising. As more and more people are going online, it becomes a ripe vector for fraud. So here's a couple of stats. One is that 48% of all fraud stems from accounts that are less than a day old. And then 57% of businesses report higher fraud losses associated with account opening and account takeover than any other types of fraud. So as we start talking about identity proofing and how that connects to Azure, this is some of the reasons, some of the motivation why you need to really prove that someone is who they claim to be, because increasingly that person claiming to be someone isn't who they're claiming to be. Back over to you, Irene.
Thank you, Dean. So, like Dean mentioned, we feel that now it's more important than ever to make sure that we protect our online identity, and that also means we protect our customers' online identity, as we have seen with the rise of online activity and online activation and the rise of fraud, as we know that identity is the control plane. And for that, that's where Azure AD External Identities for B2C customers and Jumio comes along to help customers manage and secure the identity of the end users / your end customers. So when you think about Azure AD External Identity for B2C, the way we look at this is that we build it on 3 pillars, which is 1, building flexible user-centric experiences to make sure that we only introduce friction for the end users only when it's necessary. And 2, protecting end users, applications, and the customer's brand with intelligent security through identity protection, which we will see later. And last but not least, is scaling to ensure to meet the need of your customers and partners with Microsoft's reliable service and trusted cloud. So let's look into the first pillar, which is building user-centric experiences. The way we may ensure that we can build a user-centric experiences is that Azure AD B2C supports a wide range of social identity providers. As you can see here, we support from our own Microsoft accounts, such as Outlook, up to Amazon sign-in, LinkedIn, Google, and Facebook. or Twitter and a few others. And if you have your own identity providers, we also support that because we also support other SAML providers and any Open ID Connect providers. And secondly, looking into protecting your users, applications, and brand through identity protection. Through identity protection, we can ensure we keep and we protect the identities of your customers and also keeping the bad guys out. How do we do this? It's through conditional access, which is an intelligent policy that allows you to define conditions. Basically, you define the conditions on when somebody can come in versus when somebody should be MFA'd. And that is the control part of the circle right here, which is when you should allow, when you should require an MFA, and when you should block. And third, last but not least, is making sure that Azure AD B2C enables you to scale and make sure that your solutions is available and secure for your end customers. It starts with operational excellence in the cloud, from physical security, operational security, and making sure the cloud infrastructure is also secure as well. And now Dean will be talking to you about Jumio and how this all ties together.
Thank you. So I just want to provide some really quick context about who Jumio is and how we kind of fit into this ecosystem. So first of all, what you should understand about Jumio is that we've been around for about 10 years. We're all about making the internet a safer place through really end-to-end onboarding, identity verification, authentication, and really providing an end-to-end kind of compliance solution as well. So while we're offering identity verification, we do offer biometric-based authentication, document verification, AML screening, and even transaction monitoring. So the next slide. So a big question that a lot of companies are asking these days, especially in light of some of the earlier stats, is how can modern enterprises and apps identity proof new users in order to prove that they are who they claim to be? So this is really the challenge. So ideally, you want to accelerate your digital transformation efforts. At the same time, you want to block fraudsters and cyber criminals and meet compliance mandates without adversely impacting the user experience. And so this is something that we've been doing for the last 10 years. We work with companies like Airbnb, United, Coinbase, a handful of other just mega brands to really try to solve these problems, because this is exactly what they're trying to do as well. So next slide. So before we kind of get into the solution and how it integrates with Microsoft Azure AD, I want to talk a little bit about some of the different definitions, because the term identity verification has been bandied around a lot, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So I want to kind of maybe ground this conversation in some definitions by Gartner. Gartner refers to identity proofing as any tool that provides confidence in the genuine presence of the identity owner, right? So we're talking remotely. So when someone claims a digital identity, what kind of assurance can you have that that person is in fact that person? And then they also distinguish that from identity affirmation tools. And those are tools that add confidence, but cannot by themselves provide identity proofing, because they do not prove that the individual claiming the identity is authentic. So essentially, identity affirmation tools, which we'll talk about on the next slide, are really helpful signals, but they themselves, by themselves, cannot definitively assess, that George is George, right? So let's go to the next slide. By the way, much of this Gartner information comes from a report that they just published. It's called the Market Guide for Identity Proofing and Affirmation, and they kind of walk through this in much greater detail than I'm covering today. But I think it's a helpful kind of primer on some of the ways to think about this market. Now, what's interesting in their definitions is they viewed identity proofing as really the only method for identity proofing is what they call document-centric real-world identity proofing. And what that means is the ability to look at someone's government-issued ID, pair it with a selfie, and then make a definitive decision whether they are who they say they are. They cited a number of tools that are methods of identity affirmation. and those include data-centric. So data-centric would be, for example, where if you're a company and you have an online form and you ping, for example, an Experian or a LexisNexis kind of database, and you're essentially saying, does this entity exist in the ether, exist in the internet? But it doesn't necessarily mean that that person is who they claim to be, all because they have that information, right? Because thanks to all these data breaches, in the dark web, much of our PII information is out there to be sold. They also looked at device-focused affirmation, and that has to do more with geolocation. Whoops, maybe we can go back one slide.
Oh, sorry.
Device-focused is, for example, if you're creating a form and creating it like a new account online, and you say that you're in San Francisco, but the IP of your mobile device or your computer is in Romania, there's a disconnect there that probably should be looked into, right? Then they look at other categories like digital attribute focused affirmation, and that is where they're really doing what we call device fingerprinting. They're looking at the combination of the the device settings, the browser type, the TCP/IP configuration, the OS information. All that information is fairly unique to a person, and then they're corroborating kind of all those bits of data to say that Irene is Irene, right? Again, it's helpful, but it's not definitive. There's also methods that deal with behavioral analytics, which might look at the typing speed or the mouse movements of a person, and is it a real person versus a bot? And then lastly, they could look at like the phone number. The phone number, again, tells you a lot about a given person. If that phone has been attached to Irene for 10 years and it's with Verizon, that's something very different than if the phone number was just assigned to her last week and, from a different kind of carrier. And so all of these affirmations are helpful, but they're not definitive. So let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about how Jumio does identity proofing, which is the document-centric method. By the way, the one thing I should point out is in that report, Gartner said that they see document-centric identity proofing going from being about 30% of the market now to be about 80% of the market in just 2 years. And a lot of that has to do with some of these other methods, at least becoming less reliable thanks to data breaches in the dark web. So the way that we do identity verification is we start, and you'll see this when we do the demo, of the person creating the account, capturing a picture of their government issued ID with their webcam or their smartphone. They then take a corroborating selfie, and then we also make sure that the person holding the ID is in fact the same person shown in the ID. And the reason that we have to do that is there's deep fakes, there's people who might take a picture of a picture and hold that up as their selfie. So we want to make sure that the person creating the account is physically present. And then what we do is then look at all that information and then make a yes or no decision about the person's user identity, and then share that back with our business customers, who then can either issue them Azure credentials or not to create an account. So let's go to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit about the workflow. So this is how Jumio integrates with Azure AD B2C. So it starts with the person creating an account online. Here they're doing it from their phone. From this process, we're going to ask the information from the customer, and then at some point we're going to be asking them for a picture of their ID and a picture, a selfie, and then we're going to run through a series of AI and machine learning algorithms, and then do a pretty basic risk assessment. And then from that, we're going to be able to definitively validate that that person is who they claim to be. And then we'll return that information along with all the metadata back to the business customer, and from there they can create a new user. And then at that point they can start assigning access privileges, etc., within Active Directory B2C. And so why don't we go? Perfect.
Oh, sorry, you were saying?
I think why don't we just show how this works with a quick demo?
That's actually a great idea. Before that, I would love to kind of add on a little bit. I think that this is the part where it's very interesting with Azure AD B2C. The partnership between, the collaboration together between Azure AD B2C and Jumio is very interesting, right? Because Azure AD B2C provides the authentication method to make sure that people can, end users can securely authenticate into a website, which means the customers can put in their applications, or whether it's a web app or a phone application, can make sure that it's secure and their end users' data is also secured, and each of the authentication is secure, and making sure that the identity of their end users is not compromised. And at the same time, Azure AD B2C, we don't have the capability to have to do identity verification / proofing, as you mentioned, which is why I think this collaboration is very interesting, because I think like together we can provide like a full end-to-end solution to make sure the user is not only secure after they onboard, but we also make sure that when they're onboarded, they're actually who they say they are, right? Because we certainly would like to make sure of that, especially in some industries.
Great points. Great points. Okay, so let's just show you kind of how this actually works. So what I'm going to do is we created a little bit longer video, so I'm going to ask Irene to kind of fast forward to the 40-second mark here. And before we hit the play button, I just kind of want to run you through this demo. So in this demo, we created a fake bank called Contoso, right? And in this case, it doesn't have to be a bank. It could be a sharing economy company. It could be any enterprise that deals with end user identities and onboarding. And so what we're going to do is, this is the form that the end user would see. And we're going to start by having them fill out the form, including their email address. So at this point, I think, Irene, you can hit the play button, and I'll kind of walk you through. So at this point, they're going to enter their email address, and we're going to ask them for a verification code. So at this point, an email will get sent to their inbox. They're going to check it. They're going to cut and paste that verification code in, and they're going to type that back into the form as part of our multi-factor authentication. And then they're going to fill out the rest of the form, and then this is what triggers the Jumio process. So after they fill out that basic information, they'll get redirected here, and we're going to show you a web experience, right? They're going to choose their country of their ID. So in this case, it will be United States. They'll choose a driver's license. We're going to ask them to upload a picture of their driver's license to the front side, and then we're going to ask them to upload it on the back side. And then we're going to scan it. We're going to look at all the information on that ID. We're going to look for, is this a legitimate ID or not, right? Are the photo in the right place? Is the text in the right place? Is the ghost images where they should be? And we're going to quickly assess whether this is a valid ID or not. The next part that we do in the process is we ask for a selfie, but the selfie is a little bit different. We're taking a short video, and then we're going to compare the picture in the video to the picture on the ID to make sure that they're one and the same. Right now, there's a lot of AI machine learning that goes into that, but we want to make sure we give a definitive yes or no. And so there's a lot that goes into this process. But at this point, we can probably stop the video at this point. At this point, we would take all of that metadata as far as whether the ID is valid, whether the selfie is a valid selfie, whether the picture in the selfie matches the picture on the ID, and we provide all that information back to our business customers. We probably can exit out of the video, I think, at this point, Irene. And then we give all of that data back, as well as a definitive yes or no, whether this person is who they claim to be, right? And it's going through a bunch of different security checks to make sure that that is the case. Now, I should point out that what you just saw was the web experience. We also have an API experience. We also have experience that's baked right into your an SDK, a mobile SDK. And so instead of uploading images, you literally be taking pictures of your ID with your smartphone, right? And that's probably our most popular implementation type. So there's several big advantages of this type of integration. So first of all is identity assurance. So when you're pinging a database, again, as Gartner mentions, it's helpful but not definitive. But when you're asking for a person's government issued ID, you're asking them for a corroborating selfie and a liveness check, you can have a high degree of certainty that that person is who they claim to be. The second big advantage is for many companies operating in regulated industries, it helps you meet those regulatory obligations while still delighting the customer. The whole experience we talked about normally takes about 30 to 40 seconds, right? And in most cases, it's being done on the phone. And because this process has become the main method of identity proofing around the globe, more and more people are comfortable using their biometric as their essentially their login, right? And then another key benefit with Jumio is that because we are the largest player in the space, We support 3,500 different ID types across 200 countries and territories. So virtually wherever you're at or wherever your customer's at, we can consume their ID documents and make a definitive yes or no identity decision.
So Dean, just to add here, it means that like together, then we, for an example, together, and we can serve, let's say, financial services or like a banking customer, where then Azure AD B2C can support the front end, like the bank's customer authentication and sign in, and Jumio can make sure that if somebody these days, you want to open a new savings account or checking account, you can just do it all online.
That's right. Right. And so we've been talking about identity proofing when you're creating a new account. But because we're actually capturing a biometric, and when we capture that biometric, you remember that short little video, we're also creating what we call a 3D face map. And the benefit of that is that when there's an authentication event, and maybe it's not for every login, maybe you don't require this, but certainly for some forms of step-up authentication, right? So if someone wants to transfer $15,000 to the Cayman Islands, that might be a red flag, right? So in those cases, instead of just authorizing the transaction, you could simply have them do a selfie. And at that point, we created another fresh 3D face map. We compare it to the original one when they created the account, and instantaneously we can say the person requesting this wire transfer is in fact the account owner. And in the age of account takeover, that's incredibly important.
Thank you, Dean. I'm very excited about our work together. I believe that together we can make sure that all of that happens all within the same onboarding flow and all within the same authentication flows to make sure that all the data is secure afterwards as well and stored in Azure AD B2C directory. It's like all in the same flow.
Yeah, and I think the other key point there, Irene, is the other benefit of that is that the integration I just showed has been baked in already. So we've already built in this integration with Azure, so there's no extra plumbing that needs to be done by our customers, which is also great news.
That's amazing. Thank you, Dean, and thank you, Melissa. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Please let me know if you have any questions. Currently, the next step, we would much appreciate your feedback. If you can scan the QR code here, or just go to aki.ms/surveyAD-Jumio. And for more documentations on how to implement our exciting integration together, you can go to Azure AD B2C and Jumio documentation page, where we detailed step by step on how a customer can enable Azure AD B2C and Jumio together. With that, we can move on into any questions if there's any.
It looks like we have a question from the audience. The first one being, who builds, codes, and customizes all the forms and workflows being demoed? And does the Jumio services live in clients' Azure tenant or elsewhere?
Let's see, maybe I'll take the first part of that. So the workflow itself is built by the business customers, right? So they're going to define, now we at Jumio would help you think through that whole user experience because we've done this for thousands of customers. But the actual designing of the workflow and what steps happen first, second, third would be done by the business client. As soon as we hit that part of the form that asks for, like, we're going to start triggering the identity, the identity verification, the documents, that's all done by Jumio, either via our SDK or our web app implementation. And as far as where the data sits, the data can live anywhere. So it can essentially live with us at Jumio since we've kind of captured it, or it can live with you, or it can live within your cloud. And then you as a customer can determine the retention period for that. So whether we make a verification and we automatically delete all the information from it, we can certainly honor those kinds of retention. Or if you want to keep it for a longer period of time, which many customers do, they can do that as well and say after 6 months, for example, please delete all information. So we can essentially time bomb it as well.
Thank you, Dean. That's very exciting to hear.
And then another question, maybe this one's for you, Irene. Can you explain a bit more on how Azure AD B2C connects with Jumio?
Yeah, so the way Azure AD B2C connects with Jumio is done through our something that's called the IEF framework, Identity Experience Framework. So everything is done through a method which is a custom policy. So in an overall infrastructure, it would be our during the when a person goes through the onboarding flow within the workflow itself, we will have a call to Jumio's API via a middle layer REST API. And then Jumio will do like the verification slash proofing piece and comes back with the yes, no, this person is Irene, this person is really Irene or not, and then with additional information in the form of a claim back to Azure AD B2C. And then it's written and stored there. But Azure AD B2C will not store any biometric information or anything. That's all done in the other side.
Thank you, Irene. Let's see here. Another couple questions. Possibly for Dean, how long does the identity verification process usually take?
Yeah, it's really quick. So it can be probably anywhere from 20 to 30 seconds or 40 seconds. The only thing that might delay it would only be the impact of if we have a poor quality image or poor quality selfie, right, where we might prompt the user to retake it again so we can really render the right decision. And that's actually an area that we specialize in terms of providing in-session feedback. So most customers, as much as they care about compliance and fraud, they care also an awful lot about converting that customer into a customer online. And so giving them essentially a second bite of the apple is really important. And we can help them do that if they provide a poor quality image or images.
Thank you.
Thank you. It looks like we've got another one. What countries or ID types does Jumio support? Are you only North America?
Yeah, we support, again, about 3,500 different ID types across really kind of all the major geos, 200 countries and territories. But what's also interesting is we also support, like in the US, we obviously have 50 states, but even each state has probably 6 or 7 different ID types, even just for driver's licenses. And plus, we also support not only the current versions of those driver's licenses, we support the IDs from 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 8 years ago. Right, and so that adds to the complexity of the IDs that we can support, but that also includes ID cards, passports, and a variety of other ID types that are super important.
Well, so pretty much almost all around the world with many different iterations from now and in the past and potentially the future as well.
Right, well, because in some countries, for example, most people may not have passports, but they have a national ID card. So we'll support that, right? And I think it's important for any carrier that you look at. I mean, obviously we have competition, that you make sure whatever carrier you may go to for this kind of functionality, that they can support the countries that you're in.
Got it. Thank you.
Let's see here. And I think we've got one last question. How does the licensing work?
That's a very good question. So, and a good one to close as well. So the licensing will work. The customer would have to purchase Azure AD B2C license and then a separate one with Jumio. We have different pricing model and it will be like 2 different licenses, each with 2 different companies. But the integration certainly makes sure that everything works well together so the whole flow can be done. I mean, the whole identity verification and proofing will be done in one flow altogether.
Yeah, and just maybe just add clarity for Jumio's pricing. Our pricing is based on a per transaction basis. So if you expect to do 100,000 verifications in a year or 20,000 verifications, your pricing would be based on that expected volume.
Got it. Ours is slightly different. It's based on monthly active users and the first 50,000 miles are free.
Perfect.
Perfect. And I think we are a little bit over time, but it's been really great. Thank you, Melissa. Is there any other? Or we can also follow up afterwards as well.
Absolutely. No, I think we're good. We've addressed all the questions, so we can bring it to a close if you're ready. Wonderful. So this brings us to the end of our session today. We want to thank you all for joining. The link to the survey is posted. We will be sending materials out to those that attended. And thank you very much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.